I last left off exploring how the methods Dale Carnegie outlines for how to win friends and influence people, don't criticize or argue, never talk about yourself, always smile, and so on, are nothing short of a call for the reader to be a people pleaser. And in relation to this call to people please, or always stroke others' ego, Carnegie makes major claims about the nature of happiness. Act as if you are already happy, and that will tend to make you happy. This is where the discussion surrounding positive thinking that I have alluded to previously comes in. As Carnegie writes, everybody in the world is seeking happiness, and there's one sure way to find it. That is by controlling your thoughts. Happiness doesn't depend on outward conditions. It depends on inner conditions. And I will address this literary reference later, but as Carnegie adds, nothing is good or bad, said Shakespeare, but thinking makes it so. Put another way, you don't need anything tangible, anything real outside of yourself whatsoever to be happy. Happiness can be boiled down to your perception, and that is all in your head. And so, through Carnegie, you can trace back the fixation on being positive and the pervasive use of the adage, just be positive, back to the early 20th century. But the trail doesn't end here. Carnegie also cites Elbert Hubbard, who, like Carnegie, naturally also had a background in sales. As Carnegie quotes, "Picture in your mind the able, earnest, useful person you desire to be, and the thought you hold is hourly transforming you into that particular individual. Thought is supreme." Now, I could not confirm it as a perfectly accurate quote from Hubbard, but I did also find the following continuation. Thought is supreme, and to think is often better than to do. Preserve a right mental attitude, the attitude of courage, frankness, and good cheer. Darwin and Spencer have told us that this is the method of creation. Each animal has evolved the parts it needed and desired. The horse is fleet because he wishes to be. The bird flies because it desires to. The duck has a webbed foot because it wants to swim. All things come through desire, and every sincere prayer is answered. We become like that on which our hearts are fixed. That's right. The animals willed themselves into the beings they became. And thus you are also able to will yourself into becoming whatever it is you want to be. Again, according to Hubbard, it's all in your head. To be clear, this even twists the ideas of Darwin and Spencer. It is nothing short of an attempt to attach a scientific label to concepts that cannot even begin to approach the level of pseudoscience. But turning to the evolution of ideas, and not the evolution of creatures willing themselves into being other creatures, and tracing the roots of the obsession with positivity back up to its branches, in more recent years, this kind of belief system has given rise to the idea that positive thinking leads to positive health outcomes, whereas negative thinking leads to negative health outcomes. And while it should be obvious that negative thought and emotion have their purposes in life, I will run back through some of the academic literature on this matter, as I have previously covered it. Barbara Held, in her article, The Tyranny of the Positive Attitude in America, is helpful for an initial explanation of this literature. Analyzing the work of psychologists David Watson and James Pennebaker, Held writes how these authors found that people high in so-called trait negative affect, which subsumes such aversive mood states as anger, disgust, scorn, guilt, fearfulness, and depression, and includes a trait-like tendency to dwell on one's own failures and shortcomings, to be less satisfied and more neurotic, and to focus on the negative side of others and the world in general, are no less healthy when health is measured objectively rather than by self-report than are people high in trait positive affect, which reflects such mood states as energy and enthusiasm, and includes the trait-like tendency toward well-being and extroversion. And herein lies the problem. There is plenty of research that suggests quite the opposite from these conclusions, that there are different health outcomes for such individuals. But such research is based on the highly problematic methods of self-report. Such methods are the reason why much of psychological research and sociological research more broadly should be seriously questioned. To move on, however, summarizing experiments related to negative affect, Joseph Fargas writes in his article, Don't Worry, Be Sad, on the cognitive, motivational, and interpersonal benefits of negative mood. These studies offer convergent evidence for the often adaptive, beneficial effects of negative affect for cognition, judgments, motivation, and social behavior. These findings stand in stark contrast with the unilateral emphasis on the benefits of positive affect in the recent literature, as well as in popular culture. It is now increasingly recognized that positive affect, despite some advantages, is not universally desirable. Tracy Mayne, in the article Negative Affect and Health, The Importance of Being Earnest, concludes that the cognitive and behavioral components of negative emotion are also complexly related to health. Anxiety and depression can improve symptom recognition and result in a more realistic assessment of health. They can motivate care-seeking and can elicit social support and caretaking in others. Anxiety and guilt can motivate preventive health behaviors. However, intense and frequent negative affects may result in attempts to regulate feelings with health-damaging behaviors. In short, Mayne is suggesting we may want to take a more balanced approach to life, rather than taking a one-size-fits-all, just be positive approach. Researchers from the University of Waterloo and the University of New Brunswick write in their article, Positive Self-Statements, Power for Some, Peril for Others, that injunctions to think positively are pervasive in North America. Self-help books, television shows, and loved ones advise thinking positively when one faces a challenge or is unhappy. Yet the present results suggest that for certain people, positive self-statements may be not only ineffective, but actually detrimental. When people with low self-esteem repeated the statement, "I'm a lovable person," or focused on ways in which the statement was true of them, neither their feelings about themselves nor their moods improved. They got worse. Positive self-statements seem to provide a boost only to people with high self-esteem, those who ordinarily feel good about themselves already, and that boost was small. In other words, the people who are most likely to be targeted with this whole tyranny of the positive attitude are probably the very people who will benefit the least from it. And this is just a quick glimpse of the literature, but it is enough to highlight just how far off the mark the likes of Carnegie are with their emphasis on positive thinking, or with their idea that you can shape the entirety of reality with your own thoughts. More specifically, however, there is a set of research that exists that relates to Carnegie's directive to smile, even if you don't want to, because acting if you are happy will make you happy. Again, you don't feel like smiling? Then what? Two things. First, force yourself to smile. If you are alone, force yourself to whistle or hum a tune or sing. Act as if you were already happy, and that will tend to make you happy. From Science Daily, we have the following headline: Psychologists find smiling really can make people happier. And I am using this article because it perfectly encapsulates how research findings can be misconstrued. What were the actual results of the research conducted by investigators at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and Texas A&M, as outlined here? Using a statistical technique called meta-analysis, Coles and his team combined data from 138 studies, testing more than 11,000 participants from all around the world. According to the results of the meta-analysis, facial expressions have a small impact on feelings. For example, smiling makes people feel happier, scowling makes them feel angrier, and frowning makes them feel sadder. The obvious key detail here is this small impact. Moreover, as one of the researchers specifically adds, even with these results in hand, we don't think that people can smile their way to happiness. The problem, however, is this is exactly what the cultural message has been, and even the headline of this secondary source here suggests that same message. But also keep in mind, to dig in even deeper for a moment, this UT Knoxville, Texas A&M paper was a response to a 2016 paper, which documents the efforts of numerous researchers trying and failing to replicate a famous 1988 study. The original 1988 study examined the supposed facial feedback hypothesis, the broader idea that people's affective responses can be influenced by their own facial expression. And this was not a new idea. Even Darwin himself suggested such a possibility years earlier. But the results of this one study were latched onto for at least a couple of decades as evidence, not just of the possibility of a general facial feedback hypothesis, but as evidence for the idea that, yes, in fact, smiling will make you happy. However, such research seems laughable, not only with the fact that it could not be replicated, but with the fact that what the researchers were actually examining in practice was people rating the funniness of cartoons while holding pins in their mouth, a supposed accurate measurement of inducing a smile or frown. In short, This whole set of papers is a perfect case of researchers or others taking incredibly narrow bits of information and drawing broad conclusions. It should be obvious that such perspectives, which dismiss whole swaths of human emotion, can be inaccurate and highly suspect. But also keep in mind that in terms of Carnegie, when Simon & Schuster published How to Win Friends and Influence People, the Great Depression was still ongoing. In that context, Carnegie's words, "Happiness doesn't depend on outward conditions, it depends on inner conditions," and this whole "just smile and be positive" worldview is frankly disturbing and inhumane. It's a narrow, one-size-fits-all approach that rejects any of the nuances of the human condition. But again, it is apparent that the intended audience for Carnegie's work is salesmen, just as its author too was a salesman. To reiterate, How to Win Friends and Influence People is principally about how to manipulate others for monetary gain. But I will leave it off there, picking back up next time with a fascinating line of justification Carnegie presents with his teachings. I hope to see you there.